and that's dividing for focus really doesn't help. And we are thankful that UK always supported Ukraine.
On set, Sean, great to see you. As
Morning,
well.
Wolf.
So what's the significance, do you think, of Cameron going, Foreign Secretary going, but of course making Ukraine his first stop?
I think it's very significant. A heavyweight like Lord Cameron turning up. There's been concern that Ukraine has dropped off the radar of the media. And why is that important? Well, the support, military support and financial support of the West is utterly critical to the progress of the Ukraine conflict and its resilience against Russia. So with the summer offensive, if you remember, that's almost 6 months ago that started, but Ukraine couldn't have been better prepared. And largely, they haven't actually changed the lines on the map a great deal. They've stopped the Russian assault, but 6 months on, it does look a little bit stalled. But Zelensky's ambition has not changed at all, and he would have been deeply worried when the world's focus shifted from Ukraine across to Israel, and therefore it's a great opportunity, particularly so early in Lord Cameron's tenure, for him to visit Ukraine. I think it's very significant.
Well, you said the focus has shifted a little bit, so update us. What is the latest on the ground in this war?
There's been so much going on, but from a grand strategic perspective, the big thing is the weather change. Since the start of Israel, the rains have fallen. Ukraine is a breadbasket, really, of a lot of Europe, and therefore the fields become impassable with the amount of rain. That means all of the manoeuvre has to happen on the roads. That makes it very predictable, and it makes it very difficult to fight a war. And it's also miserable for the force on the ground. But there's three main areas, if we look at the map, of where the fighting is largely taking place. If we look initially, the spring offensive was focused to the east of Zaporizhzhia. If you recall, that was where the multi-layered defence was, where the Russians had laid tank traps, they'd laid dragon's teeth, they had minefields, and they had ditches. Ukraine has made a progress through that, about 15 kilometres through, but hasn't made a breakthrough yet. Inching forward, and they're still inching forward, but it becomes very, very difficult in the winter. If you look at the second area, which is where the Russia's on the front foot, that's to the east near Donbass, is Avdiivka. That is where they're throwing a lot of troops there. And unfortunately for the Russians, they've been just doing waves upon waves of infantry over the last 2 or 3 weeks, suffering massive casualties. But it does appear that's coherent with what President Putin is trying to achieve, which his special military operation has seized the Donbass. And the third area is to the east of the Dnipro River, which is fascinating. If you remember, the Kharkovka Dam was blown, which stopped anybody crossing the Dnipro River, and therefore Russia hadn't got many defences to its western edge. Ukrainians have got a little bit of a foothold on the eastern side. Now, from a military perspective, Russia should have swept that off. They didn't, and it's now becoming bigger and bigger. If that gets significant, once the freeze starts, once the rain's finished and the freeze started, that could massively undermine Russia's position. It just shows where the relative priorities are. They're not prioritising the land bridge. They are prioritising Donbass and securing Crimea.
And just finally, what do you think President Zelensky will be saying to David Cameron once the cameras have left the room with this summit? I mean, is there more that the UK could or should be doing immediately, or is this much more about saying to David Cameron, fly to America and convince Biden, Congress, Blinken to step up and deliver the aid that's been promised?
Bluntly, I suspect it's D, all of the above, bluntly. But the main thing, I think, is that Valery Zaluzhny, who's the head of their Ukrainian military, he, a couple of weeks ago, wrote a paper and had some interviews that really turned around and said what we need from the West, and almost hinted that they were in a stalemate. And that was interpreted as being ready for negotiation. Well, the harsh reality is President Putin is not going to negotiate until after the presidential elections, the US presidential elections next year, because he will hope there'll be a change of administration and therefore potentially an erosion of support for Ukraine. So there's no chance of any sort of negotiation soon. So what I think President Zelensky will be needing is get us back on the centre of the world stage. If we don't get the weapons that we need to fight come springtime, it's a lost cause. And I think that's what Lord Cameron, as the heavyweight, will be able to bring to President Zelensky. Get it back on the world stage, get the message to America, and get those weapons flowing again.
Sean, as always, thanks so much. Now, commuters are set for yet more travel chaos before the year is done, as train drivers will stage a series of one-day strikes next month. Members of the ASLEF union will stage industrial action at the beginning of December. Commuters will be impacted on the 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 6th, 7th and 8th of December. Different rail operators will be impacted on different days, with ASLEF saying it originally planned to strike on just one day, but decided to spread its industrial action across multiple days. In addition, all ASLEF members will also refuse to work overtime between December the 1st and December the 9th. Our correspondent Milena Veselinovic joins me now with more. And Milena, were we expecting some more action potentially in this area, or did this take everyone by surprise this morning?
There were hints that things weren't going very well. We heard from the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, yesterday. He told the group of MPs at a select committee that the mood music coming out of Aslev wasn't positive in terms of a breakthrough. There has been an offer on the table since April, and that is an offer that Mark Harper said was fair. The government does have a stake in this dispute because they do control what's on the table in the negotiations. But that same offer has been rejected numerous times as risible as by Aslev union bosses. They say that it not only is the pay increase not enough, it doesn't match the cost of living crisis. They say it's a question of 4% over 2 consecutive years, so 4% one year, 4% another year. But they also say that that pay offer comes with conditions attached that would change the way that their members work, which they say is unacceptable. So no one budging here, it seems. And who's caught in the middle? Again, it's passengers, but it's also businesses who are hoping to make some money out of that Christmas rush. A lot of the hospitality businesses make the bulk of their revenue then, so they will also be affected. Doesn't seem to be a breakthrough on the cards anytime soon.
Milena, thanks so much. Now, a deported killer is offering to return to Britain to show his victim's daughter the location of her remains, more than 50 years on from her death. Nizamuddin Hussain says he wants to help the daughter of Muriel McKay locate her mother's body, saying he wants to find her before he himself dies. Our crime correspondent, Martin Brandt, has this report.
Hello, Nizam. This is Diane.
Oh, hello, Diane.
It's an oddly warm greeting for a killer and his victim's daughter.
Hi, how are you?
All the better for seeing you.
Diane's mother, Muriel McKay, was kidnapped 54 years ago. Her body was never found. Nizam Hussain and his brother were convicted of her murder and jailed for life. Eventually freed and deported to his native Trinidad, Nizam has offered to show the McKay family where he buried Muriel's body.
Well, it's very hard for me to talk about this because it's quite painful, but if you can come and help us find her, of course we'll be very glad to bring you over.
I'm quite prepared.
You're quite prepared to come over and explain and show us exactly where you put her?
Yeah.
He's a man of few words.
Nizam says they kept Muriel at their Hertfordshire farm. When she suddenly collapsed and died, he buried her behind a barn. Last year, police searched part of the grounds but found no trace of Muriel. Her family say they dug in the wrong place. Nizam has a new passport, but there's a hurdle to overcome. He's asked the Home Office to lift his deportation order so he can return to the UK and reveal the burial site. He wrote, "I believe I am the only living person who knows where Muriel's body is and would like her body to be found before I myself die." Muriel was married to Australian newspaper executive Alec McKay. Her kidnappers mistook her for Anna Murdoch, wife of Alec's boss, Rupert.
What's it like having to talk to the man who killed your mother?
It's very hard, but have you had so many years with nobody to talk to and no leads and no hope of ever finding her body? It's actually a relief to talk to him.
The Home Office is considering Nizam's request to lift his deportation order, and Scotland Yard detectives are deciding if they need to search the farm again. Martin Brunt, Sky News.
To the Middle East now, and Israel Defense Forces say fighter jets have targeted a house belonging to a senior Hamas leader. Meanwhile, the IDF says it's continuing its operation inside the Al-Shifa hospital, Gaza's largest medical facility. The IDF claims weapons including grenades have been discovered and that underground tunnels have been targeted. Hamas denies using the complex as a base. Well, the President of Israel, Isaac Herzog, has said a very strong force may need to stay in Gaza to prevent Hamas from re-emerging after the war. And the US President Joe Biden has said a two-state solution is the only answer to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict, as he warned Israel against occupying Gaza. Well, Israeli Defense Forces are operating deep inside Gaza, and Sky News has travelled with them to see the situation on the ground. They say they've created humanitarian corridors to allow people safe passage out of the north. Our correspondent Mark Stone has been along the Salah al-Din road in the southeast of the territory. A warning, his report was subject to Israeli military restrictions.
Deep inside Gaza, 2 miles from the heart of the fighting, there they were. Several hundred Palestinians, young and elderly, ID cards in hand, in a thin line facing south. The voice is an Israeli.
Over his stance on the war. A number of shadow frontbenchers quit, defying Sir Keir Starmer by voting in the Commons for a ceasefire last night. Those who backed a motion included 11 shadow ministers and aides. Earlier on Sky News, we spoke to the Shadow Defence Secretary John Healey, who voted with Sir Keir Starmer and insisted the Labour leader still has strong support from across his party.
I understand the backbenchers wanting to reflect the calls from their constituents. For the small number of frontbenchers that resigned, I'm sorry to lose each and every one of them, but each and every one of them grappled with this decision. Each and every one of them wants to see Keir Starmer in Downing Street and will work hard together with everyone else to win that next election.
Westminster our political correspondent Mari Aurora is standing by. Mari, very good morning to you. I mean, the total number, we mentioned 11 there who had some form of shadow ministerial roles, but I think it was some 56 MPs in total. Was the number higher than Keir Starmer would have liked, but as the dust settles this morning, the overall fallout perhaps not as bad as it could have been?
Well, I think to an extent, Wilfred, I think you're right. I think that it could have been a lot worse. The numbers could have been higher in terms of overall rebellion. And also, I think he didn't lose any of his shadow cabinet. He didn't lose any of his senior Labour top team. And I think that would have been a massive relief. But I do think you're right to point out the fact that 50 56 Labour MPs voted for an SNP amendment. They completely defied the leader, and that is quite extraordinary in some cases. It's well over a quarter, almost a third of all of the Labour MPs. That will be painful for Keir Starmer, not only because, the lack of discipline or collective responsibility to an extent in the party is really showing, but also it's a symbolic issue. Now, you saw from that clip there, James Healy was talking about how he was sorry to lose all of those shadow ministers. He understood how they had grappled with it. We saw from, for instance, Jess Phillips' resignation letter, how she'd found it very difficult emotionally this week to make that decision to resign from the shadow Home Office. But what is interesting is, symbolically, does this mean trouble is afoot for the Labour Party? For now, is this likely to lose them the election? Not on its own, but nonetheless it speaks to a divided party, and at some point Keir Starmer is going to have to find a way to rally the troops and find a way for the opposition to be once again united. As people always say, divided parties don't win elections. And I also think, Jess Phillips is one of the many MPs to stand down. She's the most kind of frontline, household name, as it were, and that will have been a blow. But I think nonetheless, it's important to remember that actually all of these MPs are under huge pressure from their constituencies. And I think at the end of the day, you cannot maintain a ministerial role or a shadow ministerial role if you lose your seat. And that is what they are thinking about. So can they hang on to their seats now that they have called for a ceasefire? That is really the key question.
Mario Roy, thanks so much for that. It was a crazy day in Westminster yesterday. Great stuff from you and the team throughout it. Now, the Home Secretary says he thinks the government's Rwanda plan will go ahead in the spring without the UK having to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. This morning, James Cleverly maintained Rwanda has been through a miraculous transformation and said that within days the government will upgrade its agreement with Rwanda.
Obviously, the outcome yesterday was one that we knew could happen. We'd started doing some planning around what would happen if that was the verdict from the Supreme Court judges. We've been working on this for over a year. So we have a memorandum of understanding with the Rwandan government, which we're going to upgrade to a treaty, which is legally binding, to make sure we address the specific points. And I know there was a lot of talk in that judgment, and it's a 54-page judgment, but it boils down to a small number of very, very important points, which we're already in the process of addressing.
Let's bring in our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons, who's in Calais for us this morning. Adam, very good morning to you. What has been the interpretation there on all of this? And does there continue to be a sort of sense that why is there so much focus on somewhere so far away when the issue is really emanating from where you are?
Yeah, it's an enormously complex topic. The question of migration around Europe and across this body of water has exercised minds for so many years now. And I think the Rwanda policy is part of that, but it's not the only part. So is this still a big focus here in France? Yes, it is. As I speak to you, there is a van load of French police over there. Earlier this morning, we've seen the Frontex plane going ahead. I've seen patrol vessels out here. I've also seen a big group of migrants who were on the road when we arrived here in Songat Beach this morning. Clearly had tried and failed to get across earlier today. Now, this was a disparate group of people from Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Kurdistan, maybe other nationalities as well, who are frankly determined to get over there. And when we asked this group about their reflections on Rwanda, you got a few things. One, some didn't know anything about it. B, some were aware of it and were adamant it would make no difference to them at all in their desire to cross. And there were those who said, yes, they knew about it and they knew that the policy had been declared illegal. In the time I've been reporting on migration between Europe and Britain, I've only ever met one person who said that the Rwanda policy would deter them. Until it is enacted, I think it's very hard to see what deterrence it's having. Worth saying, by the way, James Cleverly's been in that job for a few days. He's inherited a policy that he had very little part in putting in place at all. It may, in future, play a part in cross-channel migration. At the moment, I think it's a political debate rather than practically here on the ground having much impact on stopping people making this perilous crossing.
Adam, great stuff as ever. Thanks so much, Adam Parsons there in Calais. If you're watching Sky News today, still lots to come. Constructive talks, but deep differences remain. We'll go live to Beijing for the latest on the Chinese president's talks with Joe Biden. Why millions of women won't have to see their GP to get the contraceptive pill for free, and a state of emergency declared in a region of Iceland over increasing fears of a volcanic eruption. Lots more so to come. Don't go anywhere.
We started 7 years ago because things were getting so expensive, and taking children to see Santa anywhere was £10-15, but we can do that. We're not in competition with the wonderful garden centres. No way. Children can just come completely free and meet Santa. We're supposed to start at 9, but the phone started at 7:30 in the morning. And by 20 to 5, we'd booked all the slots, and the 10-minute slots, children come 10 minutes interval. We'd had 466 children booked in, 188 time slots, and unfortunately 5,000 missed calls.
I think Pamela once worked it out that if Santa was available in July and did exactly what he's doing next couple of weeks, that would just about cater for most of them. But he can't fit us in, unfortunately.
Oh, no. Oh, come on. He only really works one night of the year, doesn't he? Surely he could start in the summer to get through everyone in West Yorkshire. But I understand your point. Tell me why you do this, because obviously you like to bring joy to the families of West Yorkshire. Like you said, Christmas is such an expensive time for families who are feeling the pinch. But you're asking for donations. Talk to me about the cause you're supporting by doing this.
It's Santa's chosen charity, which is the Yorkshire Children's Trust.
And that charity looks after any children in need, a lot in hospital, and they work tirelessly for families of the children as well, all year round, not just at Christmas, but all year round.
Welcome back. The US President Joe Biden has hailed talks with China's Xi Jinping as some of the most constructive and productive discussions they've had. At a meeting in California, the leaders of the two superpowers agreed to reopen direct communications between their militaries for the first time in more than a year. Our US correspondent Martha Kellner has this report.
At a country estate, which is normally a venue for weddings, this was an attempt to avoid full-blown divorce between two world powers.
Ready, close.
From President Biden, a cordial greeting for a man he describes as a dictator. But being in the same room with President Xi did feel like progress.
Because I think it's paramount that you and I understand each other clearly, leader to leader. We have to ensure that competition does not veer into conflict.
Chinese spy balloons and inflated rhetoric have taken this relationship to its lowest point in decades. But through a translator, President Xi suggesting he too wants stability.
Planet Earth is big enough for the two countries to succeed.
The meeting was held on the sidelines of an economic forum in San Francisco, a city known for protest. The backdrop this time, war in the Middle East. Asked if Israel was justified in its raid of Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital, he said this.
You have a circumstance where the first war crime is being committed by Hamas by having their headquarters, their military, hidden under a hospital. With regard to when is this going to stop? I think it's going to stop when Hamas no longer maintains the capacity to murder and abuse and just do horrific things to the Israelis.
There is little consensus between the US and China on wars in Ukraine and Israel. But on tensions in the South China Sea, they did agree to resume military-to-military contact following near misses in the disputed waters. And on the deadly drug fentanyl, a shared determination to crack down on its supply.
President Biden, do you trust President Xi?
President Biden says that this meeting went well. He said real progress was made on a whole host of issues. But the question is, can he trust President Xi to make good on his promises? Their relationship does seem to be on a steadier footing, but with many major issues left unresolved, is it still one misstep from disaster? Martha Kellner, Sky News in Woodside, California.
Well, Asia correspondent Helen Ann Smith joins me now from Beijing. And Helen Ann, I mean, the rhetoric, at least, could not really have been much better overall. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think there has been real tangible efforts on both sides to at least be appearing to manage this relationship well. And it's not just the words, actually. It's also the gestures. Just the optics of the table was much more intimate than ones they've sat on previously. The fact they took a walk through the garden together, the fact they shared lunch, the fact they spoke for over 4 hours. All of these things, very, very intentional, I think, and a sign that both of them take this notion of stabilisation of their relationship quite seriously. When you compare it to the pretty torrid year that this comes off the back of in terms of their relations, I mean, none of these things would have even been imaginable even a few months ago. So that is progress. And I think also we shouldn't underestimate the significance of some of the things that were agreed. The military-to-military communications restarting, that is absolutely crucial. There has been such an enormous amount of anxiety and fear that any misstep or miscalculation in this part of the world could really dramatically escalate without that. That hasn't been happening since August 2022. Also agreements as well on fentanyl, and agreements at least to keep talking on things like AI and climate change. However, and it is a relatively big however, those issues are sort of the easy ones, if you like. They were the low-hanging fruit. When it comes to the bigger, more intractable issues, I mean, there is still so much that divides them. Taiwan, the South China Sea, the conflict in Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East, the economic sanctions that exist on each other. The list goes on, and there wasn't any major progress or breakthrough on those bigger, more important issues. What I think is very interesting as well is there was an incident late on in Biden's press conference that I think really encapsulates just how precarious this relationship still has the potential to be. Right at the very end, he was asked by a reporter, do you still consider President Xi to be a dictator? And that's a word that he had used back in the summer at a private event. At the time, the Chinese were absolutely furious about it. And he sort of said yes. And actually, really interestingly, the Chinese haven't responded quite as angrily as they might have, a sign, I think, of just how important and how much they wanted a good outcome of this meeting.
Great stuff, as ever. Thanks so much for that. And by the way, we'll be speaking to Professor Steve Sang, Director of SOAS China Institute, on this at 10:45. But first, a check on the weather.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
It will stay unsettled through to next week with spells of wind and rain followed by more showery days. There'll be a mainly dry and cloudy start to the afternoon, if rather cold, but the far south and west will be wet. Northern England can expect a few showers too. Rain will spread across Ireland and Northern Ireland, reaching western fringes of Britain later on. Sunshine and showers will follow. Meanwhile, southern England will largely dry up. Elsewhere, it'll stay mainly dry with the best of any sunshine across northeast Scotland, but northern England will keep the risk of showers.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Let's just now listen in to some live pictures here in Geneva of Volker Turk.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit about your discussions for entry into Gaza and Israel as you've requested, and if you're hopeful that could go ahead and when. And also on the issue of the investigation that you mentioned in your speech, the international investigation, what kind of form would you expect that to take? And how hopeful would you be of success given the lack of cooperation with previous investigations in this area?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think, first of all, I've asked Israel to give me access both to Israel but also to the occupied Palestinian territory. I have not yet received a response, which means hope, as I keep saying, hope springs eternal. I think it is very important for me to go to Israel. And also, I've been at the disposal of both Palestinians and Israelis to find a way out of this current crisis, because one of the missing links that we have seen over so many years is the one that you have mentioned. Accountability, justice, and truth-telling, including on the basis of when you have conflicting narratives, you need an investigation that is independent in order to make sure that we can actually get out of otherwise a polarized, totally binary view of what is happening or what happened. So for me, it's one big lesson learned, which actually, in a way, refreshes the human rights narrative in all of this, because that's what human rights is about. It is about accountability, it is about justice, it is about truth-telling. So I hope that there is a big lesson to be learned for the international community, for all parties to this conflict, to finally heed the recommendations that we have made, my office has made, for decades.
High Commissioner, correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like there's one country in the world that is stopping the United Nations from doing their humanitarian work in a situation that 200 other countries and yourself have called carnage and horrible situation. What does it say about the United Nations if one country can stop humanitarian work that is so badly needed? What leverage do you have to change the stance of that one country, Israel?
Well, we actually go back to the very difficult thing that one has to explain to the outside world. There is, on the one hand, all of us working for the United Nations, working under its flag. We have 102 colleagues that have been killed. This is unprecedented, as you know, and we mourn for these colleagues who have been in Gaza doing the type of services that are needed on the humanitarian front, on the development front, and that is very telling. And then there are other member states. I mean, that finally the Security Council acted on it is extremely important. Obviously, we need much more. We need this to continue, and we need to make sure that it is, at the end of the day, about international law and about accountability, as I said before, where also the whole human rights dimension plays an incredibly important role. When it comes to humanitarian assistance, I can only hope that finally this will be implemented as a matter of urgency, because, as you know, the needs are enormous, and we can only hope that all our humanitarian partners are able to do their work. But for that, you need humanitarian space, you need access, you need protection, you need deconfliction, and that's what is needed.
High Commissioner, unfortunately, the figure has gone up to 103.
103, so I wasn't aware. So 103 colleagues who died.
Associated Press.
Hi, High Commissioner. Thank you for coming to see us. I have two very quick questions, one of which is, there are leaflets being dropped on the eastern side of Khan Yunis urging evacuation. Where are those people supposed to go right now? And then the second question is about Shifa. There have been some regalia, various military goods that apparently have been turned up inside around the hospital. Was this raid justified by the Israelis?
Well, on the first one, again, international humanitarian law is clear. If the principles of necessity, precaution, distinction, proportionality require a certain military operation to be undertaken, there are obligations on the part of the military actor to ensure that those who are evacuated get an effective warning, are able to find safety, are able to be accommodated, get food, get shelter, and that it's only temporary. That's what international humanitarian law says. We know the situation in Gaza. It's one of the most densely populated zones in the world. We have been absolutely clear that at the current moment, we do not consider any part of Gaza to be safe. So it's clear that when you look at this type of operations, we need to make sure that the international humanitarian law perspective, the various criteria that need to be attached to it, are made loud and clear. On Al-Shifa Hospital, as I said, we have seen, unfortunately, the deterioration of medical facilities and hospitals, yet also medical personnel. I think the figure was 100. I can't remember exactly what the figure is on the WHO, but WHO has given us the figures of how many of the hospitals.
Well, that was Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, outlining his latest views on the situation between Israel and Palestine, and saying that no part of Gaza is considered safe at this point in his eyes. Well, you're watching Sky News Today, and we're going to continue discussing this topic, and we're going to speak to a doctor about the current situation on the ground in Gaza after this short break. A doctor who has visited and worked in Gaza and the West Bank in the past.
Live your best phone life on the UK's fastest 5G network, free.
Welcome back. Well, in the last few minutes, the UN Human Rights Chief has warned about the grave situation on the ground in Gaza. I'm joined now to discuss it all with the co-founder of Gaza Medic Voices, Dr. Omar Abdel Manan, who has been to Gaza, also to the West Bank a number of times. Thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Abdel Manan. Just first, your reflections on the current situation, I guess not broadly across Gaza, but specifically in some of these hospitals and some of those images we've seen, particularly of children and babies who are really under threat, despite being in a hospital where they thought they'd be safe and saved even.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been in contact with doctors, surgeons, allied health care professionals on the ground since the 10th of October. on a daily basis. And the situation day by day is getting worse. We are seeing, as you said, a complete collapse of the healthcare system, which has continued. And on top of that, we are seeing hospitals turning into war zones. We had mass graves being dug in Al-Shifa hospital a few nights ago, 200 people buried. On top of that, we had, as you rightly pointed out, babies being taken out of incubators and put in cots, 39 of them, premature babies that need these cots to survive. And right now, the latest update I had was 6 of these babies had died. I don't know about the other 33. I don't know what's happened with them. I suspect it's grim. I suspect many more are dying because they require oxygen. They require electricity, basically, to be able to have the equipment that they need for this. So, this notion of Gaza becoming a graveyard for children is absolutely true. It is a graveyard for children within an open air concentration camp, because that is what Gaza is right now. People in the north had migrated to the south. The north is uninhabitable. Infrastructure has been destroyed, and healthcare facilities continue to be targeted. And every day I wake up, I'm horrified to see that another healthcare professional has been killed. They have actually stopped counting how many healthcare workers have died, because they don't have time anymore to do this. It's not their priority. That we are hearing this through word of mouth. I get messages now about a colleague or a friend who's been killed or his family have been wiped out. And as a result of that, we're holding a vigil on this Friday evening at Downing Street, similar to last Friday, and we'll be calling for a ceasefire. Unfortunately, our government didn't have the courage to stand up yesterday and say that enough is enough. And I was frankly extremely disappointed by the lack of response from both the government in power and the opposition. And frankly, this is blood on their hands. And they are complicit in this because they have allowed the Israeli government to continue unabated at bombing Gaza and continuing to kill women, children, and destroy hospitals.
There's lots of questions I have. I mean, just to